And it is truly terrific, and I really can't recommend it enough. It is both enjoyable and accessible to the uninitiated. It's also thought-provoking and a good read, sorry, word. There are nice, fun facts in there, and it's thought-provoking for those of us who are more initiated. So great job on the book. It's really terrific.
Thank you. Are there any questions?
Yeah, exactly. It was good. Thank you all for coming. So that's my first question. That is my first question. Why did you write it?
When I was 5,
I only wrote one question, so this is good.
there was a total? No. Actually, the book will make a lot more sense if you do use special glasses.
You didn't tell me that in advance.
Yeah. In a sense, I have been writing this book since I was 5, so I'm not completely facetious. You work for a while, and all of a sudden, you look back and you think, I've been working in this area and observing the regular sorts of outcomes and processes and frustrations of entrepreneurs and innovators and regulators and policymakers. And I'm very happy to read economics and talk about the rent-seeking process and certain interest group equilibria and so forth. But why not write a book that really tells it in English and talks about it in a way that everybody can participate in? And I think that this makes our story a lot better amongst our expert selves. And by the way, you're all the target audience, so you have to read the book, or I'll do something dangerous. When you're threatened by an author, it's a particularly desperate situation. But I do want other people to read the book. Even my mother-in-law, who called me up excitedly. We don't, she's my mother-in-law, and she's different. She grew up in France. Nothing against France, of course. We were allied during the war. But anyway, she called me up excitedly, and somehow she had actually, gotten the book, and she was so excited to tell me that she was so surprised that it was interesting. And so that was a big thing for me, to have my mother-in-law say that it was interesting. And she also told me she was going to use it was helping her because she had trouble sleeping, and I'm not making that up. She took that as a very nice compliment to me that she was reading it late at night. So I do want people to read the book who don't have any idea what we're doing, but see the bigger picture here, because these communication technologies are important to the world. And why did I write? I wanted to try to put things in words. I think it was Einstein who said, if you can't explain it in a simple sentence, you probably don't know it very well. And if he didn't say it, he should have. So anyway, the point is, I hope this furthers that discussion and thought-provoking activities by people who are not experts in our field.
So let's go to the headlines. You offered up towards the end of the book an 8-step agenda for economic reform. You want to just give us the top wave crest of those, and then we can dig down deeper on some individual policy initiatives?
Sure. Well, yeah, in the book, and this is, I don't know if we're going to hear this line tonight, but the story may be apocryphal about Milton Friedman's class, where the student falls asleep and he throws the eraser to hit the kid on the head, and he wakes up with a start and says, "I'm sorry, Professor Friedman, but I admit I fell asleep, but the answer is reduce the money supply." So
it's one of the rare rooms where that's going to get a good laugh, actually.
So the answer is overlays, which is getting rights into the marketplace. Maybe we'll talk about this a little more, but there's some discussion in the book about how to actually put rights in the marketplace that allows responsible agents, people with real incentives and real rewards or punishment for doing inefficient things that don't help consumers, getting those rights into the marketplace and allowing spectrum to, in an innovative way, flow naturally to its highest and best use. So there's lots of opportunities for overlays with spectrum that's been allocated historically to private licensees, also for government bans where there's a lot of government users. In a sense, the incentive auction, the two-sided auction that the government did, I have praise and criticism of exactly the way that policy was crafted, but that's another thing that I think should be, the lessons from the incentive auction we're going to talk about a little later, that should be out there. There are other things, including even overcoming NIMBY problems with site location at the local government level, something the United States, because of our federal system, we tend to have a lot of problems with. And with 5G densification, we're going to have a lot more problems with it, and we need national policies that really overcome some of the natural political resistance to very productive policies to expand our communications universe. So, these are some of the things we talk about, but certainly the basic theme is that we don't want to stop the flow of radio spectrum resources to their highest valued use, and the way we can get that is through the market mechanisms, and we've had much success with this. Regulators are not oblivious to the fact that flexibility in use has been a very big deal with promoting greater opportunities for society, and Deidre gave the big picture on it, but this is the focus picture in telecommunications.
So let's do FCC reform real quick, and then we'll circle back into some of the more individual stuff. There have been obviously a number of proposals over the years. You go through a number of them, Van Deerlen and Pressler and other things, and the Trump team has talked about different ways that the FCC could be reformed. Where do you land structurally? Because you give the FCC a fair amount of criticism over the rent-seeking behavior that they indulge, and sort of the rise of the FCC as arbiter, particularly between licensed and unlicensed in the later chapters of the book. So what's the structural change that you would envision making this all work better?
Well, I mean, I'm not mapping out particular policies for today. I'm sorry, that's what most of you in this room do. But I am trying to put ideas on the table that do have a long-run impact. And certainly I say in the book, maybe my boldest pronouncement is that there will be no FCC in 100 years. I absolutely will be happy to make a bet with anybody that that's the case, and I'll bet you essentially any amount of money you want to put on it. It's just too inefficient a structure. We want to move away from that. In fact, there's a small chapter in the book called The Abolitionists about the surprising array of people across the political spectrum who have indeed argued for the abolition of the FCC. There are many more efficient ways to do this. And some folks are coming up from various perspectives now in the radio spectrum world, and even talking about a spectrum court and so forth. I have long talked about such a thing that would move the decisions away from public interest, administrative decisions that have a lot of vague, non-precedential guidelines embedded in them, and go to a system where there are precedents and there is some kind of clarity about what can take place. So you allow innovators in the marketplace to figure out what they can do to make the world more efficient and push the rules. So in terms of actually what the FCC can do, they should push mechanisms that do not involve the 10-year rulemaking and do not ask the private sector to reveal exactly what 5G, just to pick an example, is going to be about, what the costs and the benefits are for the technologies and so forth. This is something that the FCC has no reason to be asking. It's impossible for the commission to really evaluate the arguments. You heard Roger Knoll give some of these, just the basic. Even if you have good information coming in from, say, mergers, it's hard to make predictions about what will happen there. This is a much broader, more technologically dynamic kind of question. You don't want the regulators to tell the world we got to decide what's going to happen in the world, what the costs and benefits are 10, 15 years down the road before we make an allocation. You want to focus on how the allocations, how the rules, if you will, the property rights can be hammered out to give flexibility to the marketplace and to give all the interest groups that want to lobby the FCC the opportunity to go into the marketplace and make real deals about how radio spectrum can be allocated in a very efficient way. So the real structure of the FCC, and this can be, can impact actual ongoing notices and rulemakings there today, is not to have these open-ended questions that all kinds of mischief. I mean, it's really the devil's playground to say, what are the costs and benefits of 5G? Tell us exactly how the business models are going to work and what technologies we're going to use. That's open-ended. There's all kinds of who knows, and who knows what the right answer is once you come up with an answer based upon these facts. So what you want to do is foreclose that kind of open-ended process and really focus what kinds of property rights can we put in the market that are really going to give the members of society an opportunity to discover through experiments, market rivalry, and innovation what 5G or anything else is going to be.
And at one point in the book, you talk about the importance of regulators embracing their ignorance, which I thought was an excellent way to characterize it. And I think you say in a positive way that the FCC for licensed spectrum has largely moved to a situation where they're not picking 5G like they used to pick forestry or whatever other types of specific uses. They've moved to more flexible. One of the ideas that gets a lot of ink in the book, though, is this notion of taking out of the regulator's hands the choice between licensed and unlicensed. And I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about how you saw that rise through the policy process, and then what the negative impact of it and how to fix it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, just to first of all talk about the flexibility issue and do regulators get it? In a lot of ways, regulators do. Regulators do understand many of the things they don't understand. There has been a liberalization. In terms of writing the book, the easy first draft could have been, maybe some will say would have been or was, all the horror stories. We've got a section called Silence of the Entrance, where the historic public interest allocation system from Herbert Hoover and the first regulator of radio, in essence the father of the 1927 Radio Act, that all these entrants and all these innovations were stymied for years, decades, or longer, for forever, because of the way we did things. Regulators got a lot of that story, and so that's, and flexibility has been a mantra. However, you know, as President Carter said of the Vietnam War, it's an incomplete success. And when you read the current rulemakings and you find out that their spectrum is the high band, I think you call it high band spectrum, LMDS and so forth, to use terrible acronyms. And let's rejoice in acronyms, the leading output of the Federal Communications Commission. But you read these rulemakings or notices that come out and they say, well, is it okay? Tell us what mobile is going to be like in LMDS bands. Well, this is licensed, flexible use private spectrum, privately licensed, where still today in 2017, we have to ask the regulator whether or not to do mobile. Now, that's certainly an incomplete success in terms of mobility. So, I mean, in terms of flexibility that have been packed in. So we want to get that job done, I would think. Now, in terms of licensed and unlicensed, this is great. It's occupied a lot of discussion, and I don't know how far we've gotten in this, but the fact is that we want as much opportunity for competition between competing business models in the market as possible. Certainly there are rules that need to go along with use of radio spectrum because there are conflicts that can develop. We see that historically, we see it today. In general, the increase in opportunity because of the march of science and the progress in technology has created additional scarcity, additional competition for using airwaves in different fashions where they're competitive options that need rights. And so rights are very important, rights definition, a very important job that's being done here. The issues with all of these is to get, allow society to develop the best competitive outcome given all the costs. And the idea has somehow been developed, and it was, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, the idea that scarcity was over and therefore there shouldn't be any property rights and therefore we should go to a largely, if not entirely, unlicensed world. That argument seems to have gone away because there have been so many arguments between advocates over wanting to get access to more bandwidth. It's perfectly obvious that the scarcity has not gone away. It's becoming more intense with all the new technologies. The fact is that unlicensed is a different way to police scarcity. And it's a different way to establish property rights. It's government putting use rules or governance rules in the marketplace to try to keep people apart from one another. And of course, the classic unlicensed regulatory device for that is a power limit. And there are also some technology rules, but just think about it as power limits to try to localize use. And there is no sort of general property rights view. There is no Darth Vader of property rights lurking. Even on this stage, who says that everything should be privately defined and so forth, that's fairly insane. But it is a good, by the way, straw man. If you're going to argue, if you want a straw man, that's it. There are some localized uses, obviously, that should have basically no rules because there's no social coordination on a very localized level that has to take place. What does come into play, though, is how the government decides with its set of resources, its incentives, its information, to take one band one resource, one band of frequencies, and say that it's going to have this exact type of power limit or framework for interference avoidance or coordination, and not let the market make its decision on that through some competitive process. So, I mean, the easiest way for me to argue in the book, as I do, is just to talk about given unlicensed bands where there are arguments between the various unlicensed interests. So you have the car companies now at the loggerheads and, or at the throats of the Wi-Fi interest talking about 5.9 gigahertz band, which was set aside some years ago for wireless use for automotive and vehicular telemetrics and so forth. And of course, it's next to the 5.8 allocation for low-powered devices, commonly used now for Wi-Fi. And so companies are coming up that like Wi-Fi and they want more bandwidth for that to say, look, the car companies haven't done much here and we need to make some allocation to move that out and so forth. I'm perfectly willing to accept that the car companies have made inefficient use of their spectrum. But I understand that the FCC doesn't know, the advocates for the Wi-Fi champions do not know, and the car companies do not know, until forced to pay, to bid with real resources, and to have real success or failure with punishment, in the marketplace for making the wrong bid. And so what I'd like to see is I'd like to see a system where there are rights assigned, where responsible agents can make deals. And where you see that happening in the marketplace, you see all kinds of spectrum flowing from one allocation or application to another. And it does so seamlessly, we don't even notice it. And can I give one just example of this? Because this is something that happens so quietly we don't even notice it. And there, in the liberalization of licenses, there has been some allocation moving from television, the television band, to flexible use. This is an ongoing, we did allocate 486 megahertz originally to over-the-air broadcast television, and it was great for I Love Lucy, and there wasn't a lot of opportunity cost to that, but that was 1952, and so there has been this long swing away. I mean, you can in many ways call the TV band from the 1950s the spectrum warehouse, and there's been a chipping away. That's where cellular came from and so forth. Anyway, by the 2000s, we actually got some licenses out for some of the stuff that was used for TV allocations, and it went into the marketplace with flexible use licenses. And the killer app of 2005, which you all remember, was mobile TV. And so mobile TV could take some of these flexible use licenses and go ahead and sink dollars into providing mobile TV. And a company called Qualcomm spent about $1 billion plus or minus to go ahead and acquire licenses, put in the technology, and work with Verizon and AT&T to try to sell CNN and about 15 or 20 cable TV signals going straight to your handset. And you all went out and bought it right away. And if you did, you're the only people who did so, because it was a big giant flop by 2010. But by then, of course, the experiment was truncated, and Qualcomm and some other companies that actually had sort of the same idea behind them, Ohlhausen was another one, Crown Castle another, they go ahead and they just reassign their rights. And they sell the spectrum in the marketplace. And today, what was used for that allocation for mobile TV is in fact used for mobile TV. Okay, it's gone into these cellular networks. All the mobile TV is piggybacking on much more efficient way on existing networks, called broadband. And we haven't talked about it. There's no debate about it. There was a liberalization, and it allowed the market to discover where the highest valued use of those resources are. We want that liberalism to stay there so that there can be adjustments with future developments in science, technology, and consumer demand. And that's what we want with licensed and unlicensed. We don't want to dictate business models and say we love this particular allocation because it does cellular, or it does Wi-Fi, or it does satellite, or whatever. We want to have this freedom to innovate in the market around what the regulators have proclaimed to be efficient in 1952 or 2017.
So has anyone around the world experimented with this notion that you would have an auction to determine for an unlicensed business model versus a licensed model, and let it see how it works?
Well, yes and no. I mean, one of the things I try to establish is that a lot of what you see in mobile networks is, because of the flexibility, is very much what you would expect and do see as something analogous to what is thought to be the unlicensed world. The problem with unlicensed is it confuses a particular government allocation with a particular type of market use, and that's just, I mean, this is what I call at one point the spectrum, the television spectrum valuation fallacy. That is to say, broadcast television still has wonderful content. Shark Tank. That's the only one I can name offhand. But anyway, has wonderfully valuable content, but as a delivery platform, it's moribund. Okay, the allocations again from generations ago have been displaced. Cable and satellite, one generation. Now we're the second generation after that, broadband. And the TV companies that produce this broadcast, they don't even use their own vacant frequencies in digital TV stations that they own. They go to, whether it's ESPN or web-based internet distribution. They go to different distribution platforms. So you want those migrations to take place, and you get a lot of that flexibility right now with the mobile networks that have developed. A lot of plug-and-play devices, overlays, wholesale deals to enable new companies to come in as MVNOs. You get Internet of Things coming in because there is that essential liberalization of how spectrum can be used. The carriers themselves, with flexible use property rights over the mobile licenses, they become their own mini FCCs. They get to approve the devices. They get to coordinate the ecosystems and the applications. Okay, this is all what used to be Mother May I, and unfortunately Chairman Knauer and Chairman Powell used exactly the same term for this. It used to be Mother May I. If you want to use radio spectrum in a radio device or even a new network or even a new application, you have to go and ask permission. This has been ceded, delegated to the market through flexible use licenses. And the innovation in those ecosystems is just amazing. I mean, and people cite mHealth and all the Internet of Things applications. In addition to the cellular service, voice, text, broadband. Of course, the licenses don't say it's broadband. They don't say it's going to be text. That just sort of develops because of liberalism. The Apple App Store is an innovation that comes in precisely because the government doesn't regulate that. The flexible use policy allows the carriers to do it. The carriers had to compete with each other to do it. Android comes in as a competitor. RIM BlackBerry becomes roadkill. Nokia disappears. All these just Schumpeterian competition could have been blocked, would have been blocked almost certainly. So certainly delayed by a generation or more, because we just see the historical record if there were that Mother May I system. But liberalization really 70s, 80s, 90s goes around the world. The U.S. has been a leader in many respects on this, but by the time you get to the current generation on the iPhone and so forth, it's the amazing thing where companies can go to the competitive marketplace and talk to carriers about using radio spectrum. And the carriers themselves, as I say, are these mini FCCs that get to make their own rules and have to compete with one another if they make the wrong rule, if they overprotect the existing services. And just think about how tremendously interfering the iPhone is. I mean, it is just an interference machine. And the iPhone users just gobble bandwidth. Now, under the old rules, you're going to a government regulator to say it's in the public interest to have this very interfering use of radio spectrum. Well, I hope that my book does establish the fact that that's not a good argument to make up until the liberalization of these licenses, because those things drag on for years because all the incumbents just reflexively oppose that, and there's just a very go-slow system that attaches to that, and to get that stuff in the marketplace would take approximately forever. Now because we've done this fairly smart turn, in my opinion, we've gotten to a place where you can get all the kinds of business models, including things that people associate with unlicensed. You can get that through more bandwidth, more competition amongst flexible use licensees.
So let's pivot to that. So let's think about ways, your book talks about a number of different ways where you can make the magic happen of flexibility in other places. One of the primary tools you talk about is the overlay. And part of what you detail is the tremendous failure of the white spaces policy approach. I think we're, 12 years on now with no discernible consumer benefit in the United States. So talk to a little bit about how the overlays would work. How do you envision them working going forward, and what kind of bans are the best candidates for that?
Yeah, good. Yeah, it's 15 years as of December. That was the first FCC notice that unlicensed been a tremendous success. Now we're going to do unlicensed to use the white spaces in the TV ban. By the way, I mean, the idea that there are white spaces, we talk like that's, God gave us these white spaces. How did these white spaces get there? Well, that's the TV allocation in 1952. That's how the white spaces get there. And we are still, by the way, 1952 was late in the TV game. These are licenses that were first allocated by the FCC in the 1930s. And we're still trying to get rid of the decisions made there on how to use that bandwidth. So in 2002, we've been there for 15 years. We essentially have zero. There are a number. You can look in the book I had, I think, 594 white space devices. They have to be registered. And that's not 594 million or 594,000. That's 594 white space devices. We've been doing this a long time. And here's the essential problem. We've got these TV stations spewing out emissions that essentially have no social value. But we have to protect them because it's broadcast services, and that's what the FCC is there to do, and that's the mission. So there's all this stuff that's not utilized, even given this, and all the taboo channels and spaces between stations. And it's very difficult, it's illegal to use those spaces for anything until the FCC says, here's some white space rules. We can do unlicensed, low power, and the first thing we're going to make sure is that there's no interference to the TV reception. So now this is a phantom service, creating phantom white spaces, now leading to a very serious and long-lived rulemaking to create a new phantom market that we're still waiting for. As soon as the policy says we're going to protect TV broadcasting right where it is, you know that it's failed. Because the issue is how to get the TV broadcasts on a more efficient platform. Now, I've been writing these papers for a while. I mean, the numbers are in the book. But, for something less than $3 billion, and by the way, if you give me the $3 billion, I'll be happy to do it. You can put every household that doesn't have cable or satellite service, let alone internet, every non-cable satellite subscription household, you can give them a free satellite TV signal with all the local TV stations. Okay, you can do that for $3 billion nationwide. You could have a reverse auction. You could make me bid to get that business, and so forth and so on. This could be done very, very simply. So we have a situation where we get these the TV ban needs to. But what we do is we say we're going to freeze the TV ban, and now there are interested parties that like unlicensed and want to keep the 1952 TV allocation somewhat intact, so that there can be white spaces, and that now we can have the government tell us what kind of rules for transmission these little low-powered devices can have. And guess what? The government's going to set rules for the devices that make the devices very inefficient. That's why 15 years later, we're still at a place where these things aren't used. I know there are lots of reasons about uncertain. Of course, regulatory uncertainty is part of all this, because you're tying up all this stuff with new regulations and old regulations, and you're telling the regulators you've got to figure out how to cooperate between the TV stations that continue to broadcast and the new users, the folks using the unlicensed devices. That's the path you've chosen. I, of course, said at the outset this is not the way to do this. What we want is an overlay in the TV band to try to figure out how to pay off the TV stations to move. They've already moved in reality. Okay, they have to move in fact, get out of the broadcast, go cable, satellite, and broadband 100%. And in 2009, 2010, the FCC, doing exactly what I told them almost, did say, yes, we should pay off the TV stations in some measure, and have a two-sided auction to do that, and proceeded to have the incentive auction, and we're still running through the reallocation through that. So that was not the way I would have done it with overlays, and filed with the FCC at the time on that. But look, the FCC went in the right direction. I have some disagreements about how rapidly and how much and how successfully that went in terms of what we need to do. But that is exactly the right direction. There needs to be an elimination of the 1952 allocation. You can't get that with unlicensed, because under unlicensed, the assumption is the TV stations stay there and the unlicensed devices are regulated by government rules and coexist peacefully according to our sharing terms. That's not working, and we need to go a new path.
So, but the overlays are not only limited to broadcast in your view, right? So you would apply them to federal government users as well?
Absolutely, and Commissioner Rosenworcel has talked about hunting licenses for allocations to government bans, sell permits in the marketplace, and I don't care if they go cheap. I suspect they might. I want firms in the market to have an incentive to use whatever they can figure out how to free up for the existing bans, meaning that the firms would have to coordinate and help and pay for better radio systems for existing government users. They would have to they would have to coordinate with government policymakers to get additional rules in place to affect transitions where there's old technology and bad systems being used for radio. And I want parties out there with a profit incentive in a competitive world where they have to buy the licenses through bidding to actually bring something to the table that helps the regulators, after the regulators write the rules and assist in some of the other transitional items, that helps the regulators actually do something that's very, very hard, and that is to get a government agency to let go of something when you can't pay the government agency anything credible in terms of normal financial incentives. And so some of those very hard problems as I think I put it in the book, who would you rather negotiate to get spectrum more efficiently used by the Forestry Department? Would you rather the NTIA at the Commerce Department negotiates with the Forestry Service, or the Department of Defense for that matter, or would you rather that a hunting license was issued and Halliburton bought it? And Halliburton got whatever spectrum they could free up by reorganizing and upgrading the federal use of the radio spectrum, and then using that for a profitable outcome for Halliburton. You think Halliburton might have some tricks up its sleeve? Why do you think Halliburton hires the generals, by the way? They know how to get things done, and until the Department of Commerce starts hiring generals, I don't think they can pay them what the market price is for that. It's just not going to happen that way. And I'm not ridiculing this process at all. That's the constraint. And we need to be smart about putting our own spectrum policies into place that reflect those realities.
So I want to go to some questions from the audience, if we can, and we have one right there. Oh, Gary, you got some praise in the book, so we can make sure you get.
Hi, I love Tom's book. I read it first week it was out. He's got a lot of great things in it, and I think we'll have maybe a spirited discussion at 3 o'clock about some of the specific issues. But one thing that Tom said, and Bryan, you were the head of CSMAC, which is and I was on that, which is the committee which looks at government spectrum and sharing and all of those. It ain't the Forestry Service, it's the DOD and it's Navy, and I don't know how to get out of that. So I would be interested in both of your comments on how feasible that is.
Did I say nice things about Gary?
You did well.
I had a note, criticize Epstein but a lot of stuff gets cut, Gary. It might have been in the original. I have 195,000 words with the accepted manuscript. They only published 120,000. You know how these things go. I'll look it up for you, though. Anyway, the DOD is the big kahuna on this government use of spectrum, no question, and they have, for good reason, they have a lot of authority. So it shouldn't be easy, but again, I want, to the extent we can use overlays, I want interested parties negotiating across the table from the DOD to get this done. Now, if there are other ways to do this, and there are some other ways, and there, you know, we've had some success. I mean, the overlays have been done, by the way, and the OMB and some government agencies have facilitated this. And the incentive auction, by the way, helps, I think, inform us as to how government agencies, including the FCC, can help make transfers of resources that do provide the right incentives for government agencies, private licensees, which was the incentive auction, but also the DoD. Now, it's a real. I mean, I can't say I wish we could pay off the DoD and just have all these the current leaders of the Pentagon take the money and run. We probably don't want that. So I understand that there's a reason for red tape. It protects, you know, the bureaucratic rules protect us. But we do have to come up with better systems, and I really am very heavy on the overlay. Now, in England, so in other countries, the UK in particular, has had a very interesting experiment with administered incentive pricing to try to impose prices for spectrum use on agencies. And again, that's a very incomplete success. Again, I mean, if an agency has to pay something extra for spectrum, they just put it in their budget and tell Congress they need extra for that, or they, you know, it's out of one pocket into another. And so these things are very difficult. I mean, I've even cite the evidence on state lotteries to support education. Do they really have any support on educational funding? I think the evidence is no, they don't. If more money goes into the lottery, then it just comes out when the legislature allocates. And so a lot of these problems in the public sector, very hard to get the incentives to really focus on that. So I don't pretend to have a total solution on it, but I do like the approach of overlays. I want Commissioner Rosenworcel to keep pushing on what she calls hunting licenses. Other people have called them bounties, and because those are competitive incentives.
And you point out in the book that compromises and footnotes matter, right? That you're not going to solve all this in one fell swoop, and that there are national security issues that do make these complicated. That being said, and I think this is one of the things we talked about, have any other countries in the world moved to treating spectrum like any other resource, so that when the military needs land for a base, they go and buy the land? Here, is there any country in the world that makes the government pay for spectrum in a market?
Yeah, well, that's. I can't say that, I can't say that there's a particular example of that. There have been countries that have gone farther than the U.S. in terms of explicit property rights in radio spectrum, and further liberalizations in statutes in Australia, New Zealand, Guatemala, and El Salvador. I almost said famously. Of course, it's not famous to anybody, but maybe in my house. But they have liberalized a lot, and in fact, these experiments 20 years ago in Central America, El Salvador and Guatemala, are pretty remarkable, because these were two fairly poor, certainly relative to the United States and even Mexico, Central American countries that just have minimalist rules and a wide degree of liberalization, and it's proof of concept. Now, the world has not been reborn because these small markets have invited more competition, but they have gotten more competition, and the systems have worked. And there's no reason why a government can't have a better, more transparent accounting system for spectrum. That we certainly buy resources, and where there's a holdup problem, there is a constitutional means in the United States or other countries for takings. But at least we have an accounting when the government needs land for a military base or resources or tanks. There are contracts. And there are ownership and ownership attached to these things. It's not just we penciled out some stuff and decisions were made decades ago and we can't get it to go away. We want more transparency and better accounting, and so that comes from these market incentives.
All right, Michael, last question for us.
Okay, yeah, Michael Calabrese, New America. Tom, you mentioned auctions for flexible use spectrum, a big step forward from command and control. Certainly, it did away with or minimized the service rules, and I agree with that. But I think at the same time, we need to recognize that in those auctions, PCS, AWS, that there was by design an effort by the commission to tailor those licenses for a certain business model, for a certain social purpose, which was ubiquitous wide area coverage networks, using the lower band spectrum, and so you had long license terms to amortize expensive base stations. You had non-competitive renewal, so the same kind of permanent licenses you criticize about broadcasters. Of course, you had gigantic license areas, which meant that it would be very difficult to disaggregate that later. And you even had mandatory separate uplink and downlink bands to conform exactly to an industry's business model and technology. So I guess with that in mind, my question is, as we move up the spectrum, right, into mid-band and high band, where inherently we're talking about adding capacity, not coverage, wouldn't it make, to sort of avoid the problems that stem from the sort of fossilized allocation system, inefficient secondary markets, might it make more sense to have competitive renewal for licenses and licenses with smaller areas that are smaller building blocks, so that there's a greater chance for the marketplace to work over time?
Yeah, well, yeah, great question, but that's a wonderful setup. The long license terms are not why television broadcasting is today there as an inefficient roadblock. That is absolutely not the case. The case is, and those licenses are renewed all the time, but they're renewed with these restrictions on how you can use radio. The only thing you can do with one of those licenses is broadcast a TV signal according to the FCC rules. It's the liberal, and short terms are a disaster for investment. They're gonna slant it to stuff that doesn't take any fixed investment, because then you can't amortize it over the life of the term. You get appropriated in your investment. Okay, what you want to do is you want to have long-term rights. The expectation of renewal is exactly right, and you want to have flexibility in the market that this stuff can get traded around, just like in media flow and with mobile TV. The large areas are fine with me. I'm fine with that. I want lots of competitors out there, but it's not the atomization project in the United States, where we have over 50,000 licenses for 4 national mobile competitors is sort of an international absurdity. I mean, much larger license areas, national licenses are the rule around the rest of the world, and that works fine. You can split them up and divide them. If the markets want to go that way, that's fine too. But if you have aggregation in government auctions, particularly if we have combinatorial auctions, that actually solves most of that problem. Now, here's the place where I would agree completely. The build-out requirements on the licenses can subvert some business models that you might like, you might call unlicensed. You shouldn't have build-out requirements that force the non-flexible use of the radio spectrum to have a particular type of network. You should allow people to do plug-and-play devices, naked spectrum, if you will, where they're licensing devices to use particular bands because they think that that's a great way to create an ecosystem, and they have certain technology. They can become a mini FCC. This is some FCC boilerplate, certainly quoted in the book on this. It's absolutely correct. So the build-out requirements are problematic for having a full range of competition, but the long license terms and the expectation of renewal in the large areas are not there. I'm completely on the other side for that.
All right, with that, round of applause for Tom. And I think we're now headed to our 3 breakout sessions, Scott.
We'll now go to the 3 breakout sessions: copyright, spectrum, and net neutrality.
Well, I rudely didn't thank you.
And